Cryptozoology has always been a minor interest of mine. I say minor because it was something I only enjoy casually. A few internet articles here and there, scrolling through a couple of pages on a Tumblr blog dedicated to it, maybe watching one of those Bigfoot documentaries. You know, that kind of interest. Nothing serious. Generally, that'd be pretty common for most people. Most people, however, do not live in my little town, where a supposed cryptid is how many folks here make a living. See, I live in a small town in the UK, more specifically in the northwest of England. It's a tiny place, not many people outside of the country have likely heard of, unless they've already been there for whatever reason or have an interest in cryptids. My small town is situated by one of the many lakes that dot that part of the country, and as many bodies of water do, we have our own Loch Ness monster. So many people claim, anyway. I'm sure many of you are sceptical of that, as you are of any such monster. Who can blame you? I grew up here, and I didn't buy into it either. I found it interesting, sure, but I didn't believe it. Same as I didn't believe those people who claim aliens probed their backsides or that Bigfoot had destroyed their camp. It was something to read about and enjoy, but not something I believed in. Most of my generation and that of my parents felt the same, but many of my grandparents' era clung to the belief in that monster. They stayed away from the lake unless they were in decently sized boats or one of the many ferries that travelled the length of the lake to nearby settlements. Not us kids and teens though, especially not in the summer. Most of the time British summers are nothing to brag about. They're pretty warm, sure, but usually cloudy or wet. Sometimes, however, we're blessed with a heat wave. Nothing was better than a dip in the lake during that heat. During the school holidays, the older kids would hang out by the lake well into the evening. The worst thing that would ever happen is someone would get cramp while swimming and we'd have to drag them back to shore. Or someone would get their foot tangled in some lake weed and freak out until they realised what it actually was. Nothing sinister, nothing serious. Most certainly, no lake monster. One particular day during the Easter break, where it was much too cold to spend more than 5 minutes at a time in the lake, I was spending my time climbing the many tall trees that covered the areas around the lakes. Maybe I was a bit too old for tree climbing, most likely, but it'd always been something I'd enjoyed doing. Something about climbing as high as I could go and settling down on a sturdy branch, just overlooking my surroundings, was something that I enjoyed. Most of the time I'd just watch the boats going up and down the lake, people going about their business, cars passing down the country roads. Just typical stuff, nothing worthy of merit. But this day in spring, was completely different. The day itself was like any other, a chilly but sunny day in late March. I'd already taken up my temporary church in an old oak, where I'd stay for an hour or so before going to meet some friends. From where I was perched I could see 2 young kids, maybe 8 or 9, playing down by the shore. They weren't close to the water, just sitting in the grassy area a little ways off the bank. 2 girls. I couldn't really see what they were doing beyond that general observation. This was nothing out of the ordinary. What was unusual was the large, grey horse trotting along the shoreline towards them. Horses weren't exactly an unusual sight themselves out in a rural town, but they were usually in their fields or accompanied by a rider. There was no one else in sight, and this horse had no saddle or any other type of riding equipment. There are no true wild horses in the United Kingdom. Only the semi-wild horses make their home in the New Forest, somewhere right at the other side of the country. Tourists were always crossing through the private island and leaving gates open. Animals were bound to get out on occasion. The kids took immediate notice of the animal, looking up from their chatter and letting out delightful squeals. I could hear them up from my spot on the tree. I watched as they ran up to it, fearless, as all children were, oblivious to the fact that if they spooked it, one kick from its front or back legs could shatter their developing bones. I watched as the pair gleefully pet the animal. The horse itself didn't seem to mind the attention, which led me to believe it was frequently used for riding, most likely one of the horses rented out to the tourists so they could enjoy a ride through the countryside. The horse lowered its head, allowing one of the kids to press a hand onto its muzzle. I could hear their delightful laughter as the pair took turns alternating between stroking its flank and head. It was pretty cute, I have to admit. There's always something magical about an unfamiliar animal being content with your presence. With how calm this horse seemed to be, I didn't bat an eye as it lowered itself to the ground. The pair of kids seemed ecstatic about this, climbing onto the animal's back. Not exactly safe or smart, but kids don't really think like that. And I'm sure the horse would have made it very clear that it didn't want them climbing all over it if it wanted to. It was a pretty big horse. It took me a few moments to realise the children were no longer letting out happy squeals and giggles. They were screaming. I couldn't understand why at first, but as my vision focused more on the horse, I knew. How I hadn't noticed the change, I don't know. But where once it had been dappled grey, it was now black. The kind of black that seems to absorb all the light around it, distorting it. It seemed to be dripping wet. Even from my spot in the tree, I could see the tangled mess of its waterlogged mane and tail leaking water onto the ground. Its eyes were the worst of it. I shouldn't have been able to see them this clearly from such a distance. But even in the dull spring sun, I could see the glowing from these sickening, milky eyes. It threw its head back, rising to its feet with the children still on its back. They were trying to get off, but they couldn't do it. I don't know how, and I'm sure they didn't know how either. But no matter how much they struggled and screamed, they couldn't get off that damn horse. It was like they were super glued to it. I couldn't move from my spot, no matter how much my mind screamed at me to jump down and do something, anything. I'm ashamed to admit fear consumed me. Sweat dripped down my brow as my breathing grew more rapid by the second. My heart was beating so hard and so fast that it hurt. I have no proper words to describe the primal terror that gripped me. The same terror I imagine gripped our ancestors when confronted by a giant cave bear or an angry mammoth. Though where their flight or fight instinct would have kicked in, mine didn't. I was simply frozen. Frozen as the beast charged towards the water, screaming children on its back, their cries not silenced until their heads dipped under the water. Water that frothed and bubbled as they struggled beneath the surface. Then, nothing. Just an eerie stillness on that spring morning. Not even the birds sang. I think they knew. Animals just know these kind of things. I don't know how long I sat up in that tree just staring over the water where that horse had vanished into the murk. I don't know what became of those kids, but I know they were never found, and that they never will be. It was written off as an accidental drowning. Their parents beat themselves up over it, as any parent would. Nothing like this had ever happened before in our little community. Kids who grew up around the lake pretty much knew how to swim by the time they could walk, and they knew to be careful in the water. It didn't add up, of course, but beyond that, no one could explain it. I think the parents cling to the hope that their children simply ran away or were kidnapped, so that one day they might be able to find them again. And I can't blame them for that. I never told anyone what I saw. No one would have believed me anyway, save for a few ancient crones that nobody ever took seriously, who frequently babbled about ghosts and ghouls. It haunts me that I did nothing, that I simply watched as those innocent children were pulled into the watery grave. I never went into that lake after that. To anyone that asked, I simply said that I didn't like the way the smell of the lake water clung to me. I didn't think I'd ever tell this story, but I still live in this town over a decade later. And last night, I saw a grey horse stalking along the lakeside.